Listen carefully because what I'm about to tell you will make you question every message you've ever received from someone who is not your age, and it might already be happening to you. Someone has fallen in love with you, but there is a gap between your ages that changes everything you think you know about attraction and attachment. I am a psychologist, and I want you to stay with me because this is not just about romance, it is about psychology, power, and emotional vulnerability. Before you continue, I need you to like this video and subscribe because what you learn here may you from making a mistake you cannot undo. Now, imagine someone older or younger than you starts paying attention to you in a way that feels intense, almost unreal, like they see something in you no one else does. Your mind does something very dangerous. It fills in the gaps with meaning. It tells you this must be rare. This must be special. This must be fate. But psychology tells us something very different about age gap attraction. It is not always about love. It is often about projection, curiosity, and unmet emotional needs. And here is where most people lose clarity. They confuse intensity with compatibility and attention with commitment. If you have ever felt pulled into someone who is significantly older or younger than you are not alone. But there is a deeper truth hidden inside this dynamic that most people never hear. What feels like connection can sometimes be emotional mismatch in disguise. When someone older connects with someone younger, there is often a psychological transfer happening. One person is seeking vitality, novelty, or validation, while the other may be seeking guidance, stability, or attention. And this imbalance creates a powerful emotional charge that feels like love, but is often chemistry built on difference rather than alignment. You may find yourself thinking about them constantly, replaying conversations, and interpreting every message as something deeper than it actually is. But your brain is not always telling you the truth. It is trying to make sense of emotional stimulation and novelty. And when age difference enters the equation, power dynamics often sit beneath the surface, influencing feelings without you realizing it. So before you call it destiny or dismiss it as wrong, you need to understand what your emotions are actually responding to. You need to understand something most people never get taught about emotional attraction across age gaps. When someone older falls for someone younger or the other way around, your brain is not responding only to the person, it is responding to what that person represents. Psychologists call this projection, and it is one of the most distortions in human connection. When you were younger, you may project safety, wisdom, or stability onto someone older as if they already have the answers to life. You feel uncertain in your own world, and they appear grounded, calm, and emotionally complete. But what you are actually seeing is not always reality. It is your need for direction reflected back at you. And when you are older, the projection can shift into something very different. Youth, energy, admiration, feeling needed, or emotionally reawakened. You may feel like you are being seen in a way that life stopped giving you years ago. But here is the truth that makes people uncomfortable. Projection feels like chemistry because it creates intensity without stability. The mind fills in missing emotional information with fantasy, and that fantasy becomes emotionally addictive. You start to anticipate messages, overthink silence, and assign meaning to small gestures that were never meant to carry weight. This is where attachment begins to form, not from real understanding, but from emotional anticipation. The more uncertainty the dynamic, the stronger the emotional pull becomes. And this is why age gap connections can feel so consuming. They activate both curiosity and insecurity at the same time. Your nervous system becomes hyper-aware. Every interaction feels amplified, and your brain starts releasing dopamine in unpredictable patterns, which creates a cycle similar to emotional dependency. But what you are really chasing is not just the person. It is the feeling of being chosen by someone who feels different from your normal experience. And that difference becomes mistaken for depth when in reality it is often just unfamiliar emotional territory. And unfamiliar does not always mean healthy or right. And when you finally slow down enough to observe your feelings without the fantasy, you begin to see whether this connection is built on mutual understanding, emotional maturity, and shared direction, or simply on emotional contrast that feels powerful but may not sustain real-life compatibility over time, leaving you with clarity instead of confusion and greater personal awareness and self-respect. There is a moment in every age gap connection where emotion stops feeling like something you are experiencing and starts feeling like something that is happening to you. And this shift is subtle but incredibly important because it is where emotional imbalance begins to shape perception without you noticing. When someone significantly older or younger enters your emotional world, they do not just bring their personality. They bring their life experience, expectations, and unconscious patterns into the interaction. And your mind begins to adjust itself around that presence in ways that feel like fascination, but are often adaptation. Humans naturally calibrate themselves to perceived authority or novelty. So, if the other person seems more experienced, your brain may unconsciously defer. If they seem more youthful or emotionally open, your brain may become more protective or more invested. And neither of these responses are neutral. They change how you interpret everything from tone to silence to affection. One of the most overlooked psychological forces here is power perception. Not necessarily real power, but perceived emotional or social power. You may start to feel like they know something you do not, or that they are emotionally ahead or behind you in a way that creates imbalance. And that imbalance can feel like attraction because it activates your need to either catch up or guide them. This is where emotional responsibility starts to blur because instead of two equal individuals relating to each other, you begin to take on roles, mentor, follower, savior, or learner without even agreeing to those roles consciously. And once roles form, feelings intensify because roles create structure, and structure feels like meaning. But meaning is not always truth. Another layer of this is attachment activation. If you have an anxious attachment style, you may find yourself becoming more preoccupied, more emotionally responsive, and more sensitive to shifts in attention. If you lean avoidant, you may feel a push-pull dynamic where closeness feels exciting, but also overwhelming. And age difference amplifies these patterns because it introduces uncertainty about where you stand emotionally and psychologically. And uncertainty is fuel for attachment, even when it is not healthy attachment. So, what feels like deep emotional bonding may actually be your nervous system trying to stabilize itself in a dynamic it does not fully understand. And the danger is not the age difference itself, but the unexamined roles and emotional expectations that form inside it, quietly shaping how you love, how you react, and how you lose your sense of emotional neutrality over time. At some point in these connections, there is usually a turning point where the emotional intensity becomes so normal to you that you stop questioning it. And that is exactly when it becomes the most influential in your decision because familiarity is not the same as safety. Just because something feels emotionally constant does not mean it is stable. What happens in age gap attraction is that emotional rhythm often becomes irregular and your mind begins to adapt to unpredictability and call it passion. When in reality, unpredictability is one of the strongest drivers of emotional fixation. The human brain is wired to pay more attention to what it cannot predict. So when someone gives you attention in waves, sometimes deeply engaged, sometimes distant, your nervous system starts to prioritize them in your emotional hierarchy without your conscious permission. And you begin to build meaning around their inconsistency. You tell yourself they are complex or misunderstood or uniquely deep. But psychology shows that inconsistency often creates more attachment than consistency ever could. And this is where emotional confusion starts to feel like emotional depth. You are not just responding to the person anymore. You are responding to the pattern they create inside your nervous system. And that pattern becomes addictive because it keeps your attention activated even in their absence. Another important layer here is the illusion of emotional acceleration in age gap dynamics. Things can move faster than usual. Emotional disclosure, deeper conversations, stronger attachment signals, and a sense of rapid intimacy. But speed is not always depth. Sometimes speed is just two people projecting meaning onto each other faster than they are actually building understanding. Real emotional connection is not measured by intensity alone. It is measured by clarity, consistency, and mutual emotional responsibility. But when age difference is involved, those foundations can be unintentionally skipped because both people may feel something significant is happening and rush to define it before they actually understand it. So, what you experience as deep connection may actually be accelerated emotional bonding without structural grounding. And over time, that lack of grounding starts to show in confusion, overthinking, and emotional dependency cycles where you find yourself trying to stabilize something that was never fully stable to begin with. And this is the moment where awareness becomes critical because once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. And you finally begin to separate emotional intensity from emotional truth. There is something most people misunderstand about age gap attraction, and it is this: the strongest feelings are not always created by similarity. Sometimes they are created by contrast. And contrast is emotionally magnetic because it challenges your internal expectations of what connection is supposed to feel like. When someone significantly older or younger enters your emotional space, they disrupt your normal patterns of relating, and your mind interprets that disruption as significance. But disruption is not the same as compatibility. In fact, the brain often confuses emotional disruption with emotional importance because it triggers heightened attention and memory encoding. So you remember the conversations more vividly, the moments more intensely, and the emotional spikes more clearly than you would in a balanced connection. But what you are remembering is not necessarily emotional truth, it is neurological activation. And this is where people start to build entire narratives around someone based on how strongly they feel, rather than how consistently they are treated. Another layer to understand is emotional asymmetry in age gap dynamics. One person often feels like they are learning while the other feels like they are rediscovering, and this creates an uneven emotional exchange, even if both people are genuinely interested. When one person feels like they are being introduced to a new emotional world, and the other feels like they are being reminded of something they lost or forgot, the relationship begins to orbit around different psychological needs without either person realizing it. You may feel like this person understands you in a way others do not, but sometimes what they understand is not you. It is the emotional version of you that fits into their internal narrative of what connection should feel like. And that distinction is subtle but critical because being understood feels like being loved, even when understanding is incomplete or selective. Over time, this creates emotional dependency, not necessarily because of manipulation, but because of reinforcement cycles. Your brain starts associating this person with emotional awakening, validation, or identity expansion. And that association becomes stronger every time there is emotional intensity, followed by relief or reconnection. But healthy emotional bonds are not built on cycles of intensity. They are built on stability, mutual clarity, and consistent emotional presence. And when those elements are missing, your nervous starts to fill the gap by increasing emotional investment to compensate for lack of predictability. And that compensation feels like deeper love. But it is actually your brain trying to stabilize uncertainty through attachment. And the more you try to make sense of it, the more emotionally involved you become. Unless you learn to step back and evaluate what is actually being exchanged versus what is being felt in the moment. Now, I want you to consider something most people avoid thinking about because it removes the fantasy and forces responsibility back into the picture. In age gap attraction, there is always a question of timing, not just emotional timing, but life timing. And even when feelings are real, two people can genuinely care about each other and still be completely misaligned in direction, stability, priorities, or emotional development stages. When one person is building identity, career, or emotional independence, and the other is in a different phase of life experience, the relationship starts to carry invisible pressure that no amount of chemistry can fully solve. Your mind may resist this idea because it feels like you are being told to question something meaningful. But questioning is not rejection, it is clarity. And clarity is what protects you from emotional confusion. Over time, what often happens in these dynamics is that both people begin to adjust themselves to make the connection work without realizing the cost. You may start shrinking certain needs, amplifying others, or ignoring discomfort because the emotional high feels worth it. But adaptation is not always alignment. Sometimes you are not growing together, you are adjusting around each other, and that difference becomes important later because adjustment requires effort while alignment feels natural. Another psychological layer here is future projection. When emotions are strong, people naturally imagine what the connection could become rather than what it actually is in the present. And age gap dynamics intensify this because the difference itself invites imagination. You start filling in future scenarios, conversations, milestones, shared life paths, but those visions are built on emotional potential, not current reality. And potential is one of the most emotionally persuasive illusions in relationships because it feels like something you are already halfway inside, even when you are not. And the more you invest emotionally in potential, the harder it becomes to evaluate present day compatibility objectively. You may find yourself rationalizing inconsistencies or minimizing concerns because your mind is protecting the imagined future you have already become attached to. But real emotional maturity requires separating what is felt from what is demonstrated consistently over time, not in moments of intensity, but in patterns of behavior and emotional responsibility. And when you start observing patterns instead of possibilities, you gain something very powerful, the ability to see whether this connection is actually building something stable or simply cycling through emotional highs that feel meaningful but may not translate into sustainable connection in real life circumstances. At this point, I want you to hear something clearly without emotion distorting it, because this is where awareness either frees you or keeps you stuck. Age gap attraction is not automatically wrong, and it is not automatically right. What matters is not the age difference itself, but the emotional structure inside it, and whether both people are meeting each other as equals in emotional responsibility, respect, and clarity, or whether one of them is carrying more of the emotional weight without realizing it. When feelings are strong, your mind will always try to justify the connection. It will create stories. It will highlight the best moments and minimize the confusing ones because that is what attachment does. It protects the bond even when the bond is not stable. But you are not your attachment response, you are the observer of it. And when you learn to observe instead of react, you begin to regain control over how much power any one person has over your emotional state. One of the most important questions you can ask yourself in any intense connection is not how do I feel, but how do I consistently feel over time? Do I feel secure or do I feel uncertain? Do I feel emotionally grounded or emotionally activated? Do I feel clarity or confusion? Because clarity is rarely chaotic and confusion is rarely random. It usually points to misalignment in timing, expectations, or emotional availability. And if someone truly fits into your life in a healthy way, you will not feel like you are constantly decoding them. You will feel understood without needing to overanalyze every interaction. Now, if you are currently in a situation like this, I am not telling you to walk away or to stay. I am telling you to slow down emotionally long enough to see what is actually happening beneath the intensity, because intensity can feel like meaning, but meaning is built through consistency, not emotional spikes. And if this connection is real, it will survive your clarity. It will not require you to ignore your instincts, your needs, or your emotional stability to continue existing. And if it does require that, then what you are feeling is not love in its most grounded form. It is emotional entanglement shaped by difference, timing, and psychological projection. And you deserve to know the difference, because once you do, you will never confuse chaos for connection.